Well, it's interesting as we begin our time. I was thinking about, I had sleep interrupted, which is not uncommon for me last night. And about 5 a.m, I was really not feeling well. And I thought, I don't know if I'm going to make it in. And then I thought, what happens if someone doesn't show up? I don't know, Ken, if that's ever happened, if you got a really late call or maybe no call at all, but I wondered what would happen if suddenly there was just no one here. And it was interesting because it totally tied into what we were going to talk about today. Now, our oldest child started college a couple of weeks ago, and so we as a family, we found ourselves with a different schedule than we imagined a year ago. And a year ago was when we planned the dates for who was going to speak here and when. And so as a result, I found myself needing to change many of the dates around that I previously planned on being here. And so I was emailing the rest of the speaking team for peace. And it occurred to me that that speaking team was essentially a group of 4 people. It was Patty and Becky and Kathy, people who you've probably met if you've been a part of this community, and myself. Now, the great thing about that realization was that this community has a better representation of women in leadership than probably 95% of the spiritual communities that I know of. So that was great, but it was the number of people that sort of made me pause. Now, there are some exceptions and there are special guest speakers, but Ken can correct me if I'm wrong because he puts together these services. But for the most part, the 4 of us are the people you'll likely find in the pulpit or in this place on a Sunday morning. Does that make sense? That's right. Now, that isn't unusual, by the way. In fact, many faith communities, if you've been a part of one, have maybe 2, but often even 1 main person, usually a guy, who is going to be the speaker. They occupy the pulpit or the platform on Saturday or Sunday gatherings. And in many churches and faith communities, you only get a different speaker when the main pastor, minister, or priest goes on vacation. And that's usually when they know the fewest people are likely to be there so as not to really mess everything up. And I've often been told during planning services throughout my 25 years in ministry, don't tell everyone the pastor's not going to be here or they won't come, right? It's like when you go to a Broadway production, a theater production, you open up the playbill and you're like, okay, is there an understudy here? Because if that little piece of paper falls out, it's going to be a bad thing. And for nearly a decade, I was on staff at a kind of mega church in Charlotte with thousands of attendees. And one day I realized that of those thousands of attendees, they could attend our church. They could have been coming for a decade and only have heard a literal handful of voices sharing in that position of being in the pulpit. And I realized there was something wrong with that. Now, we meet regularly together as a community, but we usually do so only hearing a relatively small number of voices, at least in this capacity. A few of us stand in front of those gathered in person and online, and we bring words that we hope will inspire and encourage and enlighten with whatever we're seeing and learning along our individual journey. Now, there's value to this, of course, but it has a way of artificially elevating some while minimizing many. Because there's an emotional response when there are a group of chairs facing in one direction. It immediately makes you think that whoever those chairs are facing is of some great importance, or at least there is a designation from the rest of the people. There is the expectation that the person in this position is somehow maybe wiser or more thoughtful or more something, or else they wouldn't be there. But the truth is, we all are having an equally valid and complex experience of being human, right? seminary attendance or a degree or time in public ministry. Those are all some kinds of qualifications, right? But the greater qualification is a mind and a body and a soul that has traveled through this world and had an unprecedented human experience. This community, as all communities are, is filled with authorities on living here as a human being. And in spiritual communities, like all organizations, rarely do we allow the disparate perspectives around us to be heard, to lean into the collective wisdom in our midst, to remind ourselves of the sacredness of every story, and that includes your story. And I've been dreaming of what might happen in a place like Peace if each of us says, I am joining the choir of the people who are part of this community in a way that I have never done so before. Now, as I kind of begin with us, I don't want you to equate participation in community with public speaking, right? With orating or preaching. Not everyone needs to stand in front and deliver a message that they've written in order to participate in community, obviously. Not everyone is going to be wired to do this. It takes a very special kind of mild insanity mixed with arrogance. And I remember driving home one day from church and my wife said to me, you know, it takes real guts to stand up there and think that you have something that people need to hear. Only she didn't use the word guts. She used a more colorful word. Some people have a wiring and a skill set that makes them comfortable or adept at expressing themselves in public, and some people don't. There's been surveys, and you've heard them before, that people will tell you that their greatest fear is public speaking. And the second most common fear is death. So as Jerry Seinfeld once said, that means that at a funeral, people would rather be in the coffin than giving the eulogy. So there are all sorts of people who are not part of the speaking team who make their presence felt here, right? We have people like Ken and Joe and Sally who plan and facilitate our services. We have others like Cindy and Steve who coordinate musicians and singers and speak to the collective through song. We have those who volunteer as service leaders, and then we share together our joys and our concerns, and we give insight into our experience of being human. And then we have people like Elizabeth and Susan who invite us into activism and projects in the community. Many of us are heard in very different ways in community, right? We're heard in the small and the close of relationship. We're heard in talks over coffee and in acts of kindness and in work that we do together. That is the way that we collectively sing as a people. It's not just about a performance that you see for an hour on Sunday. This is not a landing pad for community, it is a launching pad. It's the place where we gather to remind ourselves that we are invested in one another and in the life of this planet. Coretta Scott King says, the greatness of a community is most accurately measured by the compassionate actions of its members. And when you think about a community that is defined by empathy, that is what we seek to do every day. Now, whenever I speak, I try to open up the floor either before or after I speak so that we get to hear what's stirring up in the hearts of those who gather. And so many times that we do that, I'm reminded that great communities are ensemble choirs, they are not solo acts. And the times that we share following the actual message are usually the most profound moments. And I think the unrehearsed, the unprepared, the unpracticed stuff, that is the real stuff. And so if I said to you right now, what is the sermon in your heart? What is the message that you would share with the world? Or if you were sitting here, or standing here, what would you say about what matters to you, about what matters in this life, about why we're all here? You may be panicking that I'm going to do that. And I might. But I think truly vibrant, fully formed communities need some things. They need humble leadership that says, we don't need to control everything, and we don't need power, right? We don't need to run the show. We invite people into participating. So good communities need that. And they need people who understand that the other matters and that they matter. That every life is a story worth hearing. That every human being merits the ears of the people. That's not just in this room. That's as you walk in the places where you travel, in the places you work and study and shop, and in the places where you enjoy life, that you look and you listen for the stories around you, and you realize that they are as worthy of your attention as any you're giving me right now. Philosopher David Spangler says, some people think they are in community, but they are only in proximity. True community requires commitment and openness. It is a willingness to extend yourself, to encounter and know the other. And that is so true. Many of us have been for years with our shoulders against a group of people, and maybe we never felt like we were known or seen there. And I'm hoping that's not the case here, because that rubbing shoulders is why we're here. And when you're in the choir of the compassionate, that's what you do. You rub shoulders with people as you give your gifts. A spoiler alert, or trigger warning, depending on who you are, I'm going to share a few churchy words now that I would have been much more comfortable talking about in my old days. First one is minister. A decade ago, I was sitting in a church staff meeting at our mega church, and our children's pastor, Sharon, shared the ministry ceilings that she'd reached in the denomination that she had grown up with, because they wouldn't officially ordain her as a pastor. And everyone in the room responded with kind of head-shaking disbelief, other than some of the pastors who were probably fine with that. And she smiled and she clapped her hands and she said, I don't need to be ordained, I'm anointed. And in church language, or in spiritual language, she was saying she didn't need qualification by a group of other people, and she didn't need a piece of paper to know her experience. She knew her journey. She knew what she'd traveled through, what she'd done, what she'd seen. She'd known her study. And she believed she'd been given everything that she needed by God, and she was right. However you believe that the existence of God is. There was nothing she lacked that anyone else could give her. No credentials that were coming from a higher place than she'd already heard from. People might prefer such things, but whoever and whatever God or the divine might be wouldn't require them. Sharon said that she had as much as anyone has ever had. She had an experience of this life, and she had a voice, and that's what you have. You have an experience and a voice. And this life is now about you saying, what have I seen and what will I share? So ultimately, this is a reminder that we are all ministers. And I had a pastor say that in a church one time, mega church, and he said, we're all ministers. But no one was getting that pulpit from him. And they were allowed to minister only to the extent that the system would allow. But you, friends, are ministers in an equal way with anyone who has ever shared here. Because to minister means to meet the needs of, to attend to the pain. And you are capable of that. You're doing that right now. In the small and close of your life, you're doing that in the big things. Another church word I'm going to throw at you. Evangelist. Now, when I say that word, I imagine you picture a smooth-talking TV megachurch pastor, pulpit-pounding, brimstone-breathing minister, bullhorn-wielding street preacher, or perhaps a white-haired, grandfatherly religious elder figure. But unless you are in ministry, I'm willing to bet that you don't think an evangelist as the person staring back at you in the mirror every day. But you really should. The word evangelist just means one who brings the good news. And it's closely tied to the word gospel, another churchy word, literally referring to the good news that an evangelist brings. So spiritually speaking, the message and the messenger are inextricably and intimately connected. The good news is what you know, and the gospel that you share is the good news that you have to share. I'm hoping that you have some good news to share with the world. And this is true about each of us, right? Whatever we're passionate about. I've always joked that in addition to being a pastor and a writer, that I am a food evangelist, right? There are a few things I love more than driving around someplace that I've never been and stumbling upon some roadside barbecue joint or some hidden Italian restaurant or some random food truck and feeling like I alone discovered it. And then I run to social media to publicly bear witness to the glory of the previously uncharted source of gastronomic wonder, right? I want people to know. I mean, I wrote a book called The Bigger Table, so you probably understand that I'm a foodie. And these sort of deep-fried, chocolate-covered, pork fat-induced sermons are some of my greatest and most persuasive. So it's one thing to preach the good news of religion. It's another to say, this is so good, you are going to feel like you've gone to heaven, right? Same thing works with music. I've been passionately proselytizing for my whole life. As a teenager, my fluent love language was the cassette mixtapes that I'd put together for my classmates or my latest crush. Later years, this became home-burned CDs I handed out in my college dorm. And today it manifests itself in the far less romantic but much less time-consuming act of sharing YouTube clips on my timeline. But it's all in an effort to alter another human being's life with something that stirred me. We're all preaching something that we know something about, something that is true for us. Dozens of 100 times a day, you explicitly share the gospel of your favorite team or a local restaurant you've come across or the gym where you work out or a weight loss program you love or a new show you're streaming, a band you may have seen. In fact, your entire social media profile might be described as the gospel according to you. What is good and beautiful in this life that you have to share? It's all the beauty, truth, meaning that you've encountered. No one has the specific amalgamation of information that you have, and that's why people connect with you. It's why they call you when they're hurting. It's why they count on you as a friend. It's why they share life with you, because they can't get you anywhere else. And this is true in deeper matters. I want you today to appreciate your qualifications. Have you ever grieved? Then you are experienced in loss. Have you ever loved someone? Then you are qualified to talk about the costs and the glories of loving. Have you ever felt fear? Then you are experienced in feeling terrified. Have you ever found moments of euphoric joy? Then you are qualified to teach about joy. Back in my old church days, they used to say, God doesn't call the qualified, God qualifies the called. Today, I would say that you are the world's leading expert on your experience of being human. You are the only one who can tell the story the way that you can tell it. Have you ever thought about what makes you different from the church pastor that you used to see or to a minister that you see speaking? Very little, I would tell you that. Maybe a couple of years of seminary or a parking spot at the church in the old days. A website bio or a group of people who sit and listen to them for an hour because of those other things. But beyond that, you are identical in what you have access to and are made of. Most importantly, I want you to hear that there is power in your story and there's resonance in your voice. And you may have forgotten that. Remember, when you're little, you know who you are. You're everything. You're limitless. And somewhere along the way, you've forgotten that there's power in your story and resonance in your voice because your story feels so ordinary because you've lived in it. But it's unprecedented. And your voice to you feels like white noise because that's all you hear when you speak. But when you use that voice on behalf of others to show compassion, to work for justice, your voice is music to others. Many things begin to make us doubt our qualifications. Youth does, but none of us in this room have to worry about that. Sorry. I'm speaking the truth in love, as they used to say. Now, inexperience makes us doubt our qualifications. If something is new to us and we haven't been doing it long, we feel like, I'm not really that. We doubt our qualifications when we fail. Well, that didn't work, so obviously I'm not meant to do that. We doubt our qualifications as we get older. Well, this is a young person's thing. I don't have a place here. We doubt our qualifications when comparison comes. Well, we're on social media. Well, that's a singer. I'm not a singer. And judgment tends to make us doubt our qualifications when people have spoken into our lives that we are not meant to do whatever it is that we're doing. So we think about joining the choir today, the choir of the compassionate community. And I wanted to do this individually and collectively. That means that you decide, where do I need to move into the truest part of who I am in a deeper way, to express all that I have inside me, and then to be looking collectively at the world and saying, who are the people who are not welcomed into the choir? How can I be looking for people to invite them in to share their story? Cindy's probably always trying to get people to join the choir. And the only ulterior motive is to experience the joy of singing together. And this is not true of this choir, but I will say it's true of some choirs. The people in the choir are not necessarily strong singers. If you pull a choir apart and maybe one person is singing, you might go, that's a little pitchy, a little sharp there. But what happens is when a couple people begin to sing together, their imperfections are blended out. There's something beautiful about it. And the more voices, the more you just hear this mass of humanity, and it's beautiful. And so today, I'm not saying that any of this should compel you to volunteer to speak on a Sunday. All right, that's my job. You're not taking it. But I bet Ken would be pleasantly surprised and overjoyed to have someone say, I would like to share my story. And if it does, the beauty of what someone shares here will not be in the eloquence or the ease of presentation, but in the act of bringing it. And for each of us, we should look at what is happening around us and realize that we are joined together at this place and time in the history of the planet in a great choir that is this community. And in whatever way we feel the nudge or the spark or the invitation, let us find our place to sing.